Hi guys, last Dracula video, live and in person. I have just rewatched episode 3, and there's a lot to unpack here. I think they crammed a lot of the main ideas from the whole series into this last episode. So let's break it down. Let's start with Lucy first. I know that's not quite chronological, but bear with me. The story about Lucy is very, very closely related to what we saw in the original novel when you watch that OG Dracula video that I posted. In the original, Lucy is a fun, flirty young woman who likes to play games with various men, who does not necessarily have the best taste in men. And she does lead on our poor Peter quite a bit, much as she did in the original novel. Okay, so far we see a parallel. Dracula kills her in both. She becomes undead in both. But in the TV episode, we get a huge shift. We see her function in two ways. One, she characterizes Dracula himself. He actually says to her, "You're not afraid of death, are you?" And that's really what draws him to her. She's not afraid of anything. And so remember how whenever he feeds off someone, he picks up some of their traits, their memories, their abilities. Perhaps, we're made to think, one of the reasons he's drawn to her, one of the reasons he decides to string her along and to savor her, is because he wants to capture some of that fearlessness. So she certainly works in that way. Of course, we also at the end get quite a show after she emerges from the cremation scene, which is super ooey gooey horror stuff. She very much becomes a trope to talk about what real love is. Finally, she experiences what it is to be accepted, not because she's popular, not because she's pretty, but because she is worth loving. And so that's a very 21st century idea. It's very, very important to all of us as people. We want folks who are going to value us for us, not because we look a certain way, talk a certain way, achieve a certain something. She finally experiences that utter acceptance when the boy who's loved her all along is willing to kiss her and to release her from the living hell she finds herself in. So that's a huge, huge chunk of ideas just in that. What does love look like? What does fearlessness look like? What happens when we throw caution to the wind? Do we make stupid decisions? What's really worth it? There are some other things we learn through Lucy and those scenes. For one thing, Dracula can actually hear dead people decomposing, and some of them have thoughts, and some of them continue to hurt. The little kid is creepy with his fascination with about the pretty lady. But beyond that, I think this ties into the project you guys did about death and funeral culture. There's this huge Victorian idea that, oh my gosh, what happens if you're buried alive? Well, Moffat and Gaddis, the writers of the episode, certainly make us realize if we think that the soul exists after death, wouldn't it make sense for there to be suffering, for there to be consciousness? How do we make sense of all of that? And so they deal with it in a very creepy way in the cemetery and with a little kid who literally follows Lucy home. But there again, we see that Dracula has been surrounded by this for the 400 years or so of his existence. And that's disturbing too. We don't like to think about a kind of life where you have that conscious awareness of decay and mortality the whole time. Of course, it's in episode 3 that we see that he has another consciousness of his own mortality. This is when we see him look into a mirror for the first time, and we see what it is he beholds of himself. Yeah, he's able to project this beautiful image for everyone else. Maybe not beautiful, but certainly not scary. But he knows that he's a monster. He can't flinch away from that. He's the one person he can't deceive, he can't hide from. And so that's an important thing for us to recognize. He is certainly playing with fire every time he allows himself to be drawn into conversation, every time he gets close to someone the way he gets close to Lucy. And oh my goodness, episode 3 and the melding of the two Van Helsing women. We see the 21st century scientist and the 19th century nun, and we realize they're really not that far apart. Now, just as he can't lie to himself about the decay, he's able to lie to the Van Helsings, to Lucy, to everyone he comes into contact with about what his limitations are, what his abilities are. But Van Helsing is determined to figure out exactly what makes him tick. I think it's fascinating that we see him emerge into the 21st century only to be shocked to see who he thinks of as Agatha. Remember, he has a thing for families, for patterns. He tracked down the Archduchess 60 years after he killed her mother. He likes that kind of circular patterning. So it makes perfect sense that he's drawn into it now. I think we get some great humor as he makes sense of the modern world. I think we see both his wry, cynical, funny comic side and his psychotic side as he figures out how helicopters work and what cell phones are. And, oh yes, he can in fact hack into an iPad and contact his attorney. But for all of those shifts and for all of those changes, there are some things that don't change. And that is, he recognizes that because he is powerful, because he is rich, because he's privileged, he can work the system. When Van Helsing says to him, "Oh, you just don't understand what women's rights are," he comes back with, "No one has rights. Monsters don't have rights. Poor people don't have rights. What are rights? It's all what you take. Who has power? How do they use their power?" That's a big statement, and I think it's one that the writers want to leave us with, and we have to kind of soak in it till we get pruny. We have to think that through. We talk a lot about rights. Of course, this was a British show, but it debuted here in America too. We talk about rights, but how many of the things that we like to call rights really come down to who has what bank account, who has what connections? Is it as simple as we're all going to be treated fairly? Is that a nice little lie we like to tell ourselves? And of course, Dracula's a bad guy, so when he says it, you have to take it with a grain of salt. But for all of that, I think it raises the question, what are rights? Well, Van Helsing is using her right to die. She has come to the end of her cancer treatment. It has been unsuccessful. We learn that her sickened blood literally makes him sick, that vampires cannot drink from the dead or the dying. Nice little throwback to the old lore there. But we also see that as she approaches death, she becomes more and more like Sister Agatha. My favorite scene, I think, is when Sister Agatha visits Van Helsing in the hospital. And Van Helsing says, "Oh, this isn't my problem, I'm dying." Sister Agatha looks at her and says, "I'm dead. We're not done yet. There's more to do. We have to stop him." So, fast forward to the scene where Van Helsing shows up to do just that. How many of you thought, kind of like Peter did, that when she threw open the curtains, that the sunlight itself was going to hurt Dracula? He thought so. But what she stumbles on, I think, is both contradictory to the actual myth of the vampire, but sort of appealing for a 21st century audience. And that is this. Dracula is held back by his own fear. It's not that there's an inability to face the sunlight or the cross. He is so haunted by guilt for all that he's done. He is so ashamed of his own unwillingness to die. He is so filled with loathing for who he is, what he does, even though he recognizes that it affords him a kind of immortality so long as he chooses to have it. And when she confronts him with those truths about himself, once he sees it, he can't unsee it. And so, as she sits down at the dining room and prepares to take her last breath, he realizes that he's tired of being afraid. Okay, this takes us back to Lucy. Did feeding off her help him gain the courage to actually go through with it? Maybe? Is this sort of a conspiracy of all kinds of women? Was it the fates aligning that led him both to Sister Agatha, later Van Helsing, and to Lucy? How do all three of those female figures come together to give him this closure? Okay, the last scene, I don't know. I have kind of mixed feelings about it. On one hand, I really like the idea that he is trying to make Van Helsing's passing, in his mind, Agatha's passing, soft and painless. He even says to her, "After all this time, did you think I would let it hurt?" Now, here's my question to you. Is he talking about her experience or his own? Of course, they aren't really lying together in a bed. They're both about to face eternity, whatever that means. But by creating that illusion, is he trying to comfort himself with what might have been? Is he trying to make it less scary for her? Both? I'll let you guys be the judge of that. So at the end of it, I really do like the series. It's really not like the Dracula that I knew before. And I think that tells us something about a good story, particularly a story that's been around for a little bit. We can look at the original novel and see some of the imperialism, some of the social class issues that made up the Victorians' lives. We see the pressure for a woman to be a good girl. We see the danger of the rich foreigner. In a 21st century version, we get something else. We get a strong woman, 2 or 3 of them. We get the idea that it's good to ask questions, that figuring out what truth is matters. It can make a difference. Our sacrifices can mean something. We understand that it's important to understand the truths about ourselves, that there's a kind of freedom when we recognize who we are, what we've done, and what we can do. So I'll let you sort of think through what you take away from the episodes, and I can't wait to see what you had to say about it, both in your discussion posts and in your review of Dracula.